HairClub is not the same company that your dad or your grandfather invested in. It's very different. We've always been very progressive. We also were careful to avoid the trending, because certain trending, particularly in hair restoration, was introducing products that were not good for your health or were scam products, gimmicks. Yeah. And we always basically wanted to have a very creditable family of products.
Welcome to HairPod, the podcast where you get to hear real people talk about their hair journeys. I'm your host, Kevin Ralston, and each week I get to interview people from different walks of life whose lives have been touched by their hair loss in some form or fashion. Many of our guests have experienced hair loss themselves and found a way to get their confidence and their hair back. The experience of hair loss can radically change our lives, and not just in the way of self-confidence, finances, and the search for solutions. For some, hair loss can alter our entire life path. For this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Steve Barth, a longtime client and one of the founding fathers of HairClub. Steve has been working with HairClub for over 30 years. He shares his incredible story, his experience with hair loss, and the people who helped him along the way.
Yeah, so it was 1976 that I actually found myself wandering into 185 Madison Avenue in New York City. That was the only space in the entire city and in the entire universe that HairClub existed. What drove me into that office was probably about 2 years earlier. I was starting to really become aware that I was losing my hair. Although, again, that shouldn't be much of a surprise to anybody because there's just such a strong genetic predisposition for hair loss in my family. My mother's father lost his hair. My father's father lost his hair. My father had 3 brothers that lost their hair. So I guess in many ways, my cards were marked.
You knew it's coming.
Yeah. And, 1976 was a crazy era in the 70s or in the mid 70s. And the most popular show on Broadway was Hair.
Wow.
So the ability as a young man getting out of college and getting started in life to be able to have the confidence to go forward, build a career, and build self-esteem while experiencing thinning hair was very different then.
And at the age you're at this time at what age?
I was, 22?
22 years old.
Or 20, 21.
Yeah.
It had a
way younger than typical.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I knew of guys that started losing hair even before that, but I had curly hair too. So the curly hair, the nature of curly hair had a tendency to cover a lot of surface area. So I think I was a little deceptive for quite some time. Yeah. But then it became more and more obvious, and the impact it had on my personality, my psyche, my self-confidence was profound.
What are your options at this time in 1976? Now, I'm well aware of what you can do today, but at that time, what do you do if you're losing your hair and you're in your early 20s?
Well, there weren't a lot of options. In those days, I mean, obviously there were hair pieces and wigs, but I knew that philosophically that was not going to be right for me.
In my perception, as a kid growing up, it was always so obvious when someone had a hairpiece. You could tell. And I assume this is kind of the era that you're in, that if you go that route, okay, you may have hair, but it's identifiable to most people that you have done something to cover it up.
Well, that was the stigma.
Yeah.
And who's to say that, the people that were obvious were the people that had bad product also, even back then.
Right.
And maybe there are people that you might have bumped into that you never knew.
Steve's story began years before he wandered into HairClub for the first time. He shares with us what it was like as a young man struggling with early baldness in the 1970s. Being genetically predisposed might have lessened the shock, but it didn't lessen the blow to his self-esteem. With such limited options for solutions at the time, hair loss started to have a big impact on Steve's life.
For a young guy, 22 years of age,
the
last thing I want to do is come home and, take the hair off and put it on the dresser, okay? That certainly was not going to do it for me and wasn't going to make me feel as if I got my hair back. So I was desperately seeking out a solution that I thought that would kind of match my own personal objectives and philosophy. So there was transplants. transplants, was in its early generation, early iteration.
Right.
But to be honest with you, at that time, it wasn't, to me, a very attractive option either.
Mm-hmm.
Because at that time, the plugs, they weren't small enough, and they weren't able to put these micro plugs close enough together. You could see right through the sparse hair into the incision, into the scalp. It looked like a doll's hair.
Yeah, I always heard the term baby doll hair, and that's what they would say. And you would see it was almost imperfect lines, which hair just doesn't do naturally.
So if your goal and your aspiration was to actually have a full head of hair, especially at 22 years of age, you really weren't going to get that in transplants unless it was a very isolated area, possibly.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and then there were some really primitive techniques that were around that became outlawed. They were actually implanting into the scalp what was essentially a synthetic hairpiece.
So when you say synthetic, it's not human hair, it's plastic? Or?
In those days, the use of human hair was rare because human hair was very difficult to work with, because if you look at a human hair, a strand of human hair under a microscope, it has scales. And for our purposes, if these hairs retain their scales, then when you shampoo or when you do that type of thing, it'll cause abundant tangling. Okay. So HairClub had to find a way to strip this human hair of its scales so that it became more functional as a application that you had 24/7. I mean, you weren't removing anything. And that was the big value proposition, as I think business people would talk about, the real distinctiveness of what HairClub was doing, even back then in the 70s, was offering this experience, whereas a hairpiece or a wig was a tangible product.
Okay.
This was an experience far deeper, more philosophical. This is something that somebody could essentially, feel and adopt as if it's their own hair and go into the world feeling terrific. And that's exactly was my reaction.
Right.
When I first had this applied. So everything started, at least for my journey into hair restoration in 1976, 75. But it really started, again, I want to remind you that when I was born, because the DNA combination I had.
And you kind of know that it's coming. I knew as a young kid, I was 8 to 10, and I saw pictures of my grandparents, and it's like, okay, this is going to be my destiny.
Yeah. Listen, in most cases, it doesn't really surprise you.
No.
And, at those days, I was into music. I was writing poetry. I was doing things that were tapping into that sensitive side of me. And, I just didn't feel that hair loss was, going to work for me.
Right.
And, I remember compromising greatly. Wouldn't go out, on a Friday night if I felt that I couldn't get my hair placed just right so that it created the illusion of being more than it was.
Right.
And I would pass, and God forbid I ever got caught in rain and the hair would get wet and then it would look more sparse. So all of these things, were, really powerful concessions in my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I knew that I had to try to put this behind me. And I had to, eliminate a lot of these barriers that were holding me back.
Hair loss is hard at any age. But as Steve pointed out, the 20s are a time for self-discovery. It's a time to pursue a career, explore creativity, date, and have an active social life. It's not a time when a young person wants to worry about which hairpiece they should get or to maybe stay in because bad weather might expose their hair loss. Steve couldn't live like that.
My journey to do something actually predated even Cy Sperling and HairClub. I remember seeing a little advertisement, a print advertisement in one of the newspapers about a guy that was operating out of a very well-known haircutting salon on the west side of New York City, right by Columbus Circle. And his name, he had the greatest name in the world. His name was Jason Paul.
Jason
Paul. I have no idea if he's even alive today, but he was a formulator of hair wellness products.
Okay.
And what he was advertising and marketing at the time was that he felt that hair loss, although it was, there was a genetic component to it, obviously, but he felt that through wellness techniques and nutrition that you could go ahead and, stabilize your hair growth and eventually reverse it.
Oh, wow.
So I was really receptive to this message.
Speaking to you.
Because when you're first starting to lose hair, your first goal is, okay, how can I stop it, And even better yet, how could I regenerate?
Yep.
And I remember I didn't even own a car at that time. I was a young guy coming in from New Jersey, and I took a bus into New York City, and I met with Jason Paul, who had this little carved out area of the salon. And he brought me there, and he had a white smock on, and it was all very, the staging was very impressive. And he took a little snip of my hair, and he put it in what was this little vice, this little hand vice. What I mean is how could I describe this? He put it in this little device. He would then start winding it, which would stretch the hair. Okay. And eventually the hair would have enough tension and it would break. And he had this way of measuring the tensile strength of the hair. Now, this is how it was articulated to me. And I got to tell you, I ate it up. I thought it was just amazing. So he then put me under a machine where there was steam coming out of it. And the whole purpose of that was to try to erode or reduce a lot of the extra debris, surplus debris on the scalp that may be preventing you from growing hair or being in the best environment for growing hair. Right. And not to mention that he also prescribed some vitamins that were from Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland, that was designed to be a hair nutritional supplement. I took more of those supplements than probably anybody alive. And I was obviously excited, particularly at first. And he was a very, very legitimate guy. He was scientific. But my predisposition, my genetic predisposition towards hair loss couldn't be overcome. And I was just going to continue to lose hair. So again, this is a very natural first response at an early phase of the life cycle of losing hair. Yeah. How can I stabilize it? How can I grow it back? Right. Unfortunately, that didn't work for me.
How long did you go on this journey before you realized that this isn't the right path?
Maybe a few months, 6 months. I can't remember exactly, but it was. Yeah. But I realized that it just wasn't going to work. And I was still left with this discontent about my hair and how I looked. So, the search continued.
Anyone who's experienced hair loss is familiar with the cycle of hope and disappointment that often accompanies it. Soon after his experience with Jason Paul, Steve was introduced to HairClub founder Cy Sperling and began what would become a long-term, ever-evolving relationship with HairClub.
Cy was running a little also print ad in the back of the New York Post in the sports section. And, I saw it several times. He then finally graduated to the Sunday magazine section of the Sunday New York Times, which gave him a little bit more credibility. He had one and only one office, which was at 185 Madison Avenue on the corner of Madison and 34th Street. I was a young guy. I went in there for a consultation, not knowing much about what he offered. And we had a consultation that lasted about 3 hours. It was like, this may seem a bit melodramatic, but it was really like two forces finding themselves or two ships passing through the evening. And it was a very powerful consultation. Cy was like an action figure. He was a guy that, you just believed in. He had that aura. And you just believed that anything he said to you was going to happen. He also was a terrific business mentor. I'm getting a little off track here, but he was a terrific business mentor.
I want to hear it all.
Because he looked at things, what he taught me is never look at a business problem emotionally. Always be objective. And that's how I developed my whole approach to trying to solve business problems, by looking at a problem and looking at the world the way it is and not necessarily the way I want it to be, and working around that and creating a set of solutions around those realities.
Cy had won Steve over, and even in its early stages, so had HairClub. He was ready to have his life back, and HairClub offered him the opportunity to do that, to have hair again, even if it wasn't growing from his own head. HairClub's product was very innovative for its time and was able to allow many people, Steve included, to regain their confidence and live with hair again.
Hairpiece was not the language. That was not part of the HairClub.
What did you call it? What was the lingo?
Well, in those days, we used to call it a hair system. And the reason that we made that distinction, again, if you go back to the earlier conversation, is that a hairpiece was manufactured and produced very differently. And it was also very different philosophically. It was meant to be on, off. It was not meant to be part of active lifestyle, going to the gym, perspiring, jumping in the pool, swimming. So for a young guy that wants to essentially forget about his hair loss problem, having a hairpiece generally didn't work on a lot of levels.
Jumping in the pool was taking your hair off and then jumping in the pool?
With a normal hairpiece?
Yeah, if you had a hairpiece?
Well, generally in those days, could you jump in a pool? Probably, but probably not confidently. And you certainly wouldn't look very, very good as a result. I mean, your hair, the way that a hairpiece was manufactured is they would take the space material and they would just basically, through what looked like almost a sewing machine, inject into that what was essentially synthetic hair fiber. And it was just to fill that base. HairClub, in the strand-by-strand process, which was one of the terms that we owned and still do, I believe, is we would actually basically take a schematic and notes on the way your hair naturally grew. And when we were preparing our head of hair or our hair system, even in those days, we were adding hair, real human hair, not synthetic hair.
Okay.
I want to emphasize that.
Yeah.
Real human hair. And we were adding it in the natural direction of your hair growth. So in those days, hair pieces were basically usually cut down by barbers, whereas we were using only very talented hairstylists and cosmetologists that were using, cutting shears and layer cutting hair, which gave the hair motion and gave it movement. Right. So those are only few of the distinctions. In addition, probably the most important distinction was you weren't removing the hair. And you didn't need to, because it was real hair that was added in the, consistent and compatible with your natural hair growth, that was cut in a precise way so that it was designed to perform a lot more effectively in an active lifestyle.
HairClub became Steve's career as well as his personal hair loss solution. He loved the product and the philosophy. However, he still took great interest in Jason Paul's work and integrated this approach into his own.
They were two very different people and very different approaches. Jason was really a scientist. He formulated a product. He was interested in trying to find out the biochemical root causes of hair loss. Cy was a guy that wanted to capture the interest of somebody that got to the point that they want to do something. So his approach to communications was very different. Cy was not a technology guy. He was married actually to a stylist. Her name was Amy Sperling, and he relied on her more for technology development. Now, how was that product, let's say, in the 70s compared to HairClub products and services in 2024? Yeah. Very different. Sure. I mean, we really have advanced in every conceivable way. As a matter of fact, I always urge people that HairClub is not the same company that your dad or your grandfather invested in. It's very different. We've always been very progressive. We also were careful to avoid the trending, because certain trending, particularly in hair restoration, was introducing products that were not good for your health or were scam products, gimmicks. Yeah. And we always basically wanted to have a very creditable family of products. But remember that for the longest time, HairClub only had one single solution, which at those days
It's the end solution. It
was the end solution. It was at a point where you got physically and psychologically where you wanted to basically, create this appearance of more hair. Yeah. But it wasn't growing out of the scalp, obviously. Right. It was subject to maintenance, which people were more than willing to do because they were so delighted with feeling better about themselves. But all of those things were about one solution. It was, with all due modesty, it was I that introduced and expanded that product window and introduced hair and scalp therapy. And much of that was inspired by my time with Jason Paul. Okay. Because he was the guy that introduced me to the science of hair loss. Yes. And to products that perhaps can reverse hair loss. And I was very impacted by that presentation, even though it didn't succeed for me.
Hair loss can truly be life-altering. Like many of our guests, after experiencing hair loss himself, Steve went on to pursue a career that would allow him to help others navigate this challenge. Learning about Steve's journey with hair loss in the 70s, the technologies of that time, and specifically the development of HairClub has been fascinating. If you'd like to hear more from Steve, make sure you subscribe to the show. We'll be having him back on to discuss the development of his state-of-the-art diagnostic tool, the TrichoView Hair and Scalp Analysis System. Thanks for listening to another episode of HairPod. Check us out at HairClub on Instagram or search HairPod on Facebook to continue the conversation. If you know somebody who could benefit from hearing this episode, we would love it if you would share it with them. If you're enjoying the show, consider leaving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. We also have a website. Check it out by going to podcast.hairclub.com. We're here to build people up and share real stories so people experiencing hair loss feel a little bit less alone. And when you share, review, and subscribe, it helps us do just that. So, thank you. Until next time.